The town of Serenity Springs breathed through its green lungs, the fertile slopes of Windy Hill, where the Mendozas had built their agricultural empire for generations, and meticulously planned gardens of Fountain Valley, traditional domain of the Rivers, a family of renowned intellectuals and lawyers. Between these two worlds separated by more than geography, the flower market functioned as neutral territory, where colors and fragrances seemed to temporarily dissolve the invisible boundaries dividing local society. Isabela Mendoza walked among the stalls with a familiar feeling of being watched. At 22, she carried the weight of her last name like an uncomfortable, heavy evening gown. Her green eyes, inherited from her grandmother Beatrice, scanned the flowers with a mixture of genuine admiration and contained anxiety. She knew the foreman, George, was following her at a discreet distance, sent by her father to ensure the Mendoza heiress didn't stray from the expected path. 2 night-blooming jasmine plants, please, she asked the elderly florist, who greeted her with familiar deference. The nocturnal flowers were her little secret, her silent rebellion against the controlled, daytime life she led. Meanwhile, on the other side of the market, Lucas Rivers was arguing with a vendor about the rarity of a blue orchid. At 24, he represented his family's quiet disappointment. While his brothers pursued brilliant legal careers, he insisted on dedicating himself to painting, an activity his father, attorney Robert Rivers, considered a hobby for teenagers, not a grown man. Just look at the color gradient on this petal, Lucas insisted, holding the flower with almost reverential care. It's as if the night sky decided to bloom. The vendor shook his head, impressed despite himself. You've got an artist's eye, son, but the price doesn't change. It was when Lucas, stepping back with his conquered orchid, collided with Isabela. The impact was strong enough to make her basket slip from her hands, scattering soil and seedlings across the stone floor. My God, I'm a bull in a china shop, he said, his dark eyes wide with consternation. Let me help you. Isabela prepared a sharp retort. She was used to clumsy men trying to impress her, when something in Lucas's genuinely apologetic expression made her hesitate. He didn't seem to recognize her, or if he did, he didn't show the usual mixture of curiosity and reserve. They're just plants, she said, more softly than she intended. Nothing that can't be picked up. But he was already on his knees, gathering the small pots with hands surprisingly delicate for a man of his stature. Night-blooming jasmine, he commented, examining one of the plants. Interesting choice. Most people prefer the varieties that bloom during the day. I prefer discretion, Isabela replied before she could think better of it. There's beauty in blooming when no one expects it. He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt a strange sensation of being truly seen. Not as Isabela Mendoza, heiress to a fortune and legacy, but as a woman who preferred night flowers. Lucas, he said, extending his hand. Isabela, she replied, taking it. The handshake was firm but not too strong, and his palms had the rough texture of someone who regularly handled brushes and canvases. The minutes that followed became one of those moments suspended in time, where social rules seemed temporarily revoked. He spoke of his paintings, of the peculiar light of Serenity Springs at dusk, how the colors change with the seasons. She spoke of her passion for the piano, especially Chopin's nocturnes, which she practiced when the rest of the house was asleep. You play Chopin at midnight? He asked, impressed. My grandmother used to say that Chopin after 10 p.m. was like confessing secrets to the moon. Your grandmother was a wise woman, Isabela said, surprised that someone understood exactly what she felt playing those pieces during the quiet hours. It was when George, the foreman, appeared at her side, clearing his throat significantly. Miss Isabela, your father's expecting you for lunch. Reality fell upon them like a bucket of cold water. Lucas seemed to recognize the uniform of the Mendoza employees, and his eyes narrowed slightly as they returned to Isabela's face. Mendoza, he whispered. Rivers, she deduced from his tone. The market suddenly seemed smaller, the flowers less colorful, the air heavier. The magic of the moment dissipated, replaced by the weight of centuries of mutual distrust. I should go, Isabela said, taking a step back. Lucas nodded, his face now a mask of polished reserve. Of course. Good luck with your jasmine. She was turning to leave when he spoke again, low enough that only she could hear. There's an exhibition of local landscape paintings at the downtown gallery tomorrow afternoon. The canvases capture the twilight light over the river quite faithfully. She didn't respond, but her green eyes met his for one last moment before following George out of the market. The unspoken invitation hung in the air between them, as palpable as the scent of flowers surrounding them. On the way back to the Mendoza mansion, Isabela held the night-blooming jasmine plants firmly against her chest, as they could protect the fragile thread of connection that had just formed. Her heart beat with an intensity she hadn't felt since childhood, and for the first time in years, she felt something different from the quiet resignation that characterized her existence. Meanwhile, Lucas watched her departure with a thoughtful expression. He knew who she was, of course. The whole town knew the Mendoza heiress, albeit mainly by reputation. But the woman he'd met didn't match the image of the reserved, somewhat boring socialite the gossip described. There was depth in those green eyes, intelligence in her observations, and a spark of rebellion in her preference for night flowers. A Mendoza, he murmured to himself, picking up his blue orchid. Fate has a peculiar sense of humor. The visit to the gallery the next day became a test of her own courage. Isabela spent the entire morning internally debating. Attending would mean defying not only her family's expectations but centuries of shared and unshared history between the Mendozas and the Rivers. Not attending would mean returning to the gilded cage of her existence, where every move was choreographed and every word measured. At 2 in the afternoon, wearing a simple dress she hoped wouldn't attract attention, she told her father she was going to the public library to study native plant preservation techniques, a half-truth that made her blush inside. Hector Mendoza nodded distractedly, immersed in harvest reports. The gallery was in a restored old house near the central square, and Isabela felt her stomach clench when she spotted the entrance. What was she doing? A chance meeting at the market was one thing. Deliberately seeking the company of Rivers was another entirely. But then she saw him, standing near a canvas showing the river at sunset, and something in his relaxed yet attentive posture made her decision solidify. He turned as if sensing her gaze, and his dark eyes lit up with recognition that made her heart race. "You came," he said simply as she approached. "The river landscapes at sunset are famous," she replied, keeping her tone light, though her hands trembled slightly. "Yes, they are," he agreed, but his eyes remained fixed on her, not on the canvases. The gallery visit turned into a walk in the park, which turned into coffee at a discreet establishment where nobody seemed to recognize either a Mendoza or a Rivers. And for the first time in her life, Isabela felt truly listened to. Lucas didn't treat her like an heiress or a pawn on a social chessboard, but as a person, complex, intelligent, and with opinions of her own. He spoke of his dream to open a studio where he could not only paint but teach underprivileged children, offering them the same escape that art had provided him. She confessed her desire to transform part of the family lands into a botanical reserve open to the public, a place where people could connect with the nature their own ancestors had helped tame. "It seems we both want to use our privilege to create spaces of accessible beauty," Lucas observed, surprised. "Maybe we're both naive romantics," Isabela said with a sad smile. "I prefer to think of us as hopeful realists," he corrected gently. When the sun began to set, Isabela knew she had to return. Their time together had been a magical parenthesis, but reality awaited them outside the cozy cafe. "Can I see you again?" Lucas asked when they stopped near the square, a safe distance from the Mendoza mansion. She hesitated, the voice of duty and tradition screaming in her mind. But then she remembered the feeling of being alive, truly alive, that she had experienced that afternoon, and the answer came before she could stop it. "Yes." The smile that illuminated Lucas's face was like seeing the sun break through the clouds after a long rainy season. "There's a concert at the Botanical Garden on Thursday. Outdoor music, a mix of classical and popular. They say they play Chopin." "Thursday," she confirmed, her own smile blooming in response. The walk home seemed different that afternoon. The same streets, the same houses, the same river dividing the town into two distinct territories. But everything seemed tinged with new possibility. Isabela knew the challenges would be immense, that their families would probably never approve, that the town would talk. But for the first time, those considerations seemed less important than the promise of another afternoon like that one as she walked up the hill toward the family mansion, She noticed the first buds on a night-blooming jasmine growing along the wall. They would bloom soon, unfolding their discreet beauty, while the rest of the town slept. Perhaps, she thought, perhaps there was a way to bloom in daylight too. The concert at the Botanical Garden the following Thursday marked the beginning of a new ritual for Isabela and Lucas. Under the starry sky of Serenity Springs, enveloped by Chopin's music that seemed to weave a parallel world just for them, they discovered that the chance meeting at the flower market had been merely the first movement of a more complex symphony. In the days that followed, they found cracks in their meticulously controlled routines. For Isabela, this meant inventing visits to friends, additional piano lessons, or botanical research at the public library. For Lucas, it meant saying he was going painting in plein air in the woods surrounding the town, when in reality his favorite model had green eyes and a forbidden last name. Their refuge became Lucas's studio, a spacious room on the top floor of an old downtown building, with tall windows bathing the interior in natural light. It was organized chaos. Canvases covered with white cloths lined the walls like sleeping ghosts. Jars of brushes competed for space with stacks of art books, and the characteristic smell of turpentine and oil paint permeated the air, becoming for Isabela the scent of freedom. "It's better than I imagined," she confessed the first time he took her there, her eyes scanning the half-finished canvases, the sketches pinned to the walls, the tangible evidence of the talent her family scorned. "What is?" he asked, watching her with the concentrated intensity he reserved for his best work. "Your mind," she replied, slowly turning to absorb every detail. "It's like I can see your thoughts taking shape on the walls. In that safe space, far from the watchful eyes of Windy Hill and the suffocating expectations of Fountain Valley, they revealed themselves to each other." Isabela spoke of her lonely childhood, educated by tutors instead of playing with other children, treated as a precious asset to be protected and eventually negotiated. She told him about her father, Hector, a man whose idea of love was synonymous with control, and her mother, who died when she was young, from whom she'd inherited not only her eyes but the abandoned piano in the empty parlor. Lucas, in turn, shared the weight of being the different son in a family of intellectuals. While his brothers debated laws and philosophy at the dinner table, he observed how the afternoon light fell on his mother's face, wanting to capture that specific expression on canvas. He spoke of his father's silent disapproval, attorney Robert Rivers, who considered art an elegant distraction, not a profession worthy of the Rivers name. "He once told me paintings don't feed families or change the world," Lucas recounted, the corners of his mouth curved in a bitter smile, as if beauty were a luxury, not a necessity. "My father says something similar about music," Isabela responded, her fingers tracing the outline of an easel. "He says it's ornamentation for idle women." I never could make him understand that Chopin spoke more truth about human nature than all his harvest reports combined. It was in this context of growing complicity that Lucas began to paint her, not as a perfect Mendoza heiress, but as the woman he saw, barefoot in the studio, her hair loose over her shoulders, a poetry book open in her lap, her green eyes lost in distant thoughts. The painting captured an essence that even Isabela herself didn't fully know, a mixture of vulnerability and strength, of tradition and rebellion. "You see me differently," she observed one afternoon, watching the work in progress. "I see what's there," he corrected gently. "It's the others who refuse to see." As the portrait came to life on the canvas, their love deepened too, ceasing to be a forbidden attraction and becoming a genuine partnership. Lucas accompanied Isabela on her botanical expeditions, learning to identify native plants she intended to include in her future reserve. She, in turn, immersed herself in his world, reading about color theory and art history, becoming his sharpest critic and greatest encourager. "You should exhibit more," she insisted once, observing a series of paintings capturing the transformation of Serenity Springs through the seasons. "Not just at the local gallery. Your work deserves a larger audience." "Maybe one day," he replied, but his eyes shone with possibility. With Isabela, even the most improbable dreams seemed achievable. Outside the studio, however, the reality of their last names pursued them. They met at cafes on the border between the two neighborhoods, where the risk of recognition was lower. They walked in parks in neighboring towns, where nobody knew that a Mendoza and her rivers together represented a small revolution. But Serenity Springs was, at its heart, a small town, and the fences separating their families had eyes and ears. The whispers began as discreet sighs at social gatherings. "Have you seen?" The ladies of Windy Hill whisper behind their teacups. "The Mendoza heiress with that river's boy." The professionals of Fountain Valley commented during club cocktails. The first direct confrontation came from where Isabella least expected it. From her cousin Clara, 3 years older and married to the son of a transportation magnate, a union that solidified important business alliances for the Mendozas. "I'm worried about you, Isabella," Clara said during a family lunch, her narrowed eyes examining her cousin with poorly disguised curiosity. People were saying things, ugly things. Isabella maintained a serene expression, though her heart beat rapidly against her ribs. "The people in this town have always had fertile imaginations, Clara. You know that." "Perhaps," her cousin replied, leaning forward. "But some seeds, when planted, grow deep roots. Be careful what gardens you cultivate." The warning was clear, and Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. If Clara knew, it was only a matter of time before the news reached her father's ears. For Lucas, the pressure came differently. His older brother, Raphael, found him leaving the studio on a rainy afternoon. "We need to talk," Raphael said, his impeccable suit seeming like a silent criticism of his brother's paint-stained clothes. Inside the car, with the engine running and the windows fogged, the conversation quickly turned into a confrontation. "What are you thinking, Lucas? A Mendoza? After everything that family has done to ours." "What have they done, Raphael? Tell me something specific, not those vague stories Dad repeats like a mantra." Raphael sighed, impatient. "You know perfectly well. The dispute over the river lands in the 50s. The lawsuit they filed against Grandpa Henry. The way they tried to stop Dad from opening his practice. That all happened decades ago. What fault is that of Isabella's? She wasn't even born yet." "Blood is at fault," Raphael replied harshly. "And you're staining ours by getting involved with her." The rift between the brothers, which had always existed in the form of personality differences, deepened at that moment, becoming an abyss of fundamental disagreement. Despite the external pressures, or perhaps because of them, Isabela and Lucas found even greater refuge in each other. Their meetings became bolder. A picnic by the river dividing their family properties, a visit to an art exhibition in a neighboring town, where they walked hand in hand like any ordinary couple. It was during one of these outings that they were seen by Sergio, the fiancé her father had practically chosen for her. Son of an agave magnate from a nearby town, Sergio represented everything Hector Mendoza valued: ambition, tradition, and a fortune that rivaled their own. The icy glare Sergio shot them through the cafe window was like a blade cutting to the fragile fabric of their private world. Isabella felt her hand sweat, and Lucas, noticing her reaction, squeezed her hand with comforting strength. "It's him, isn't it?" he whispered. She only nodded, feeling the walls of her imaginary refuge crumbling around her. The next morning, the confrontation they both knew was inevitable finally happened. Hector Mendoza called his daughter into his study, an imposing room with dark oak walls and shelves filled with agricultural books and family records dating back 5 generations. "There are rumors circulating about you, Isabella," he began, his large hands resting on the back of the desk chair like a judge about pronounced sentence. She remained silent, knowing any defense would be interpreted as confession. "Your mother," he continued, his voice laden with rare emotion, "was a woman of unshakable character. She knew what it meant to honor a name, a legacy. And I don't. Is that it, Dad?" Hector looked up, surprised by the defiant tone in his daughter's usually docile voice. "This association with the Rivers, it's unacceptable. Lucas isn't a Rivers. He's Lucas, a talented artist, a kind man. A Rivers," Hector thundered, slamming his hand on the desk. "It doesn't matter what he is or isn't. His blood is impure for our lineage. His family has been our enemy for 3 generations. Because of a land dispute that happened before we were born, because of lawsuits nobody even remembers the details of. This is about loyalty, Isabella, about honor." He stood up, his imposing figure dominating the room. "You will end this romance immediately. Sergio and his family are visiting next weekend, and I will announce your engagement." The floor seemed to disappear beneath Isabella's feet. "I can't do that, Dad." Hector's expression changed from anger to something resembling alarm. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love Lucas, and I won't marry Sergio." For the first time in her life, Isabella saw her father speechless. He looked at her as if seeing a stranger, someone whose thoughts and feelings he couldn't comprehend. "Your rebellion will ruin this family," he said finally, his voice dangerously low. "You're choosing a passing whim over centuries of tradition." "I'm choosing my life over your version of it," she replied, with a calm she didn't feel. The consequences were immediate. Isabella was confined to property, her outings supervised by George or other foremen trusted by Hector. Her phone access was restricted, her letters examined before being sent. For Lucas, the retaliation came in the form of a visit from his father and brother. "This madness must end," declared attorney Robert Rivers, standing in his son's studio as if the space were morally questionable. "The Mendozas are using you to humiliate us. Can't you see that?" "Using me how?" Lucas asked, incredulous. "Isabella isn't like that. This whole romance story is probably a setup," Raphael added. "They make you fall for the girl, then ruin your reputation, and use it as an excuse to contest the water rights we've been disputing for years." The theory was so elaborate and cynical that Lucas almost laughed. "Almost. You're paranoid," he said, shaking his head. "This isn't about family disputes or water rights. It's about two people who love each other." Attorney Robert looked at the unfinished portrait of Isabella, his face contorted in an expression of distaste. "You paint the daughter of the man who tried to destroy our family. There's poetry in that, I admit. Sick poetry." That night, locked in his studio with the curtains drawn, Lucas wrote a letter to Isabella. He wouldn't send it by mail. He knew it would be intercepted. Instead, he entrusted it to a trusted friend who worked as a deliverman and knew the schedules and routes of the Mendoza employees. The letter reached Isabella 3 days later, hidden inside a bouquet of night-blooming jasmine left at the mansion's gate by an anonymous vendor. Lucas's words were a mixture of love, concern, and determination. They can try to separate us with fences of distrust and tradition, but they don't understand that love, when true, always finds a crack. "Remember your jasmine. They bloom in darkness, when nobody is watching. Our love will also find its hour." Reading the words by candlelight in her room, away from her father's watchful eyes, Isabella felt a new determination sprouting within her. Perhaps Clara was right about some seeds growing deep roots. The seed Lucas had planted in her heart had already become a sturdy tree, and no storm of family disapproval would be strong enough to knock it down. Meanwhile, in the town, the whispers grew. The forbidden romance between the Mendoza heiress and the river's artist had become Serenity Springs' worst-kept secret. And in some unexpected corners, among the youth tired of the old feuds, among the older employees who remembered a time before the division deepened, there was a spark of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, love could achieve what reason never had. Unite what had been separated for so long. The confinement on the Mendoza property became a gilded prison for Isabella. The days turned into a monotonous succession of empty hours, each moment without Lucas aching like a phantom limb. Her piano, once a source of comfort, now seemed mute, its keys unable to reproduce the melody resonating in her heart. Sergio's visit with his family the following weekend was an exercise in refined torture, while Hector and Sergio's father, Mr. Montenegro, discussed numbers and alliances in the study. Isabella was forced to entertain her imposed fiancé in the gardens. "Your father showed me the plans of the new East Wing," Sergio commented, his large, practical hands gesturing toward the distant construction. "I'll expand the irrigation channels by 30%. Productivity will increase considerably." Isabella watched his determined profile, the way his eyes calculated every tree, every square meter of land as a resource to be exploited, and felt a wave of despair. "Have you ever been to a concert, Sergio?" she asked, in a desperate attempt to find common ground. He looked at her, perplexed. "Concerts? I don't have time for such distractions." "Why?" "No reason," she murmured, her eyes turning toward the horizon, beyond the property fences, where Lucas was somewhere, living, breathing, perhaps thinking of her. That night, during the formal dinner, the announcement was made. Hector raised his wine glass, his face illuminated by a satisfaction Isabela hadn't seen in years. "I have the honor of announcing the engagement of my daughter, Isabela, to Sergio Montenegro. May this union strengthen our families and our businesses." The guests applauded politely, but Isabela felt looks of curiosity and, in some cases, pity. She remained motionless, her frozen smile an act of pure social survival. Meanwhile, in Fountain Valley, Lucas faced his own sentencing. Attorney Robert announced he would start at the family practice the following Monday. "It's time to assume your responsibilities, Lucas," his father said, adjusting his glasses in a gesture Lucas knew well, a sign the decision was irrevocable. "You'll have your own office, start with smaller cases, but under Raphael's supervision. Can I still paint at night?" Lucas asked, knowing the answer before he even formed the question. Attorney Robert sighed, as if the question confirmed all his disappointment. "Art was an understandable phase of your youth, son, but now it's time to grow up." That night, locked in his studio, Lucas looked at the nearly finished portrait of Isabela. The green eyes on the canvas seemed to plead for freedom, for courage. It was then that the idea was born, not as an elaborate plan, but as a primal impulse for survival. They would run away. The opportunity came a week later, when Hector traveled to a business meeting in a neighboring town, leaving Isabela under the less watchful care of the servants. Using a phone lent by a sympathetic maid in exchange for a promise of future help studying music, Isabela managed to speak with Lucas for 3 precious minutes. "Meet me at the old stone bridge, midnight," she whispered, her heart beating so hard she feared he could hear it through the line. "Bring only the essentials." "My heart you know I already carry," he replied, his voice a thread of hope in the darkness of their existence. The preparations were made with the precision of a heist. Isabela chose simple, dark clothing, gathered her savings, an envelope with money she'd saved for years, and the small painting Lucas had made of her, carefully rolled in a plastic tube. Lucas prepared his old motorcycle, filled a tank, and gathered his documents and a few small canvases he couldn't leave behind. He wrote a letter to his parents, not asking for forgiveness, but explaining his love, a final attempt to make them understand. The night of the escape arrived laden with omens. The sky, once starry, filled with heavy purple clouds advancing like a silent army. The wind began to howl through the cracks in the mansion's windows, announcing the approaching storm. At midnight sharp, Isabela climbed down the vine outside her bedroom, her feet finding purchase on the rough stone of the wall. Every sound made her flinch, a dog barking on a neighboring property, a door creaking somewhere in the house. She was a shadow moving through familiar fields, each step a farewell to the only home she'd known. The old stone bridge stood at the edge of the Mendoza property, where the river narrowed and the trees formed a thick canopy. It was a forgotten place, not appearing on the family's modern maps. Lucas was already there, his dark silhouette outlined against the stormy sky. When he saw her running toward him, overwhelming relief flooded him. They embraced, a strong, silent hug containing all the unspoken words, all the shared fears, all the hope sustaining them. "There's no going back," Isabela whispered against his chest. "I never wanted to go back," he replied, kissing her hair. "Only forward with you." They got on the motorcycle, Isabela holding on to him, her face pressed against his back. The road ahead was dark, winding, but it represented freedom. They accelerated, leaving Serenity Springs behind, the wind carrying away the echoes of names they were trying to escape. But the storm caught them faster than they expected. The rain began to fall, first in heavy, scattered drops, then in a torrential downpour that reduced visibility to a few meters. The wind cut like a blade, shaking the heavy motorcycle as if it were a toy. The dirt road quickly turned into a treacherous mud pit, the wheels skidding dangerously on every curve. Lucas fought against the handlebars, his muscles burning with the effort of maintaining control. Isabela held him tightly, feeling every jolt, every dangerous skid. The adrenaline that initially propelled them now transformed into visceral fear. "Maybe we should stop," Isabela shouted against the wind. "There's nowhere to take shelter here," he replied, his voice tense. "We need to reach the main road." But the main road was miles away, through increasingly rough terrain. The motorcycle, already old and overloaded, began to fail. The engine coughed, lost power, recovered for a moment, only to fail again. It was on a particularly sharp curve, where the road descended abruptly toward a small valley. That disaster struck. A mud puddle deeper than it appeared made the front wheel skid violently. Lucas fought to regain control, but was too late. The motorcycle fell on its side, throwing them onto the wet asphalt. The pain was a white flash exploding in Lucas's shoulder. He cried out, a sound muffled by the rain, as he felt something give way in his joint. Isabela was thrown forward, rolling on the rough asphalt before stopping against a tree at the roadside. She felt a sharp stab in her ankle, followed by a wave of nausea. For a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of rain hitting the asphalt and Lucas's ragged panting. The motorcycle, their only escape, lay with its front wheel twisted at an impossible angle, useless. "Lucas," Isabela called, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" "My shoulder," he groaned, trying to get up and falling back into the mud. "I think it's dislocated." She crawled toward him, ignoring the throbbing pain in her own ankle. In the darkness, with the rain washing the blood from their cuts, they found themselves stranded, injured, and trapped. The romantic escape had ended in disaster. "What are we going to do?" Isabela whispered, tears mixing with rainwater on her face. Lucas didn't answer. He was looking at something behind her, his eyes wide. Isabela turned and saw car lights appearing on the road, approaching slowly. Despair turned to panic. Was it her father? The police? The end of everything? The car, an old but well-maintained sedan, stopped beside them. The driver's door opened, and the person who emerged wasn't who they expected, but their appearance would change the course of everything. It was Mrs. Beatrice, Isabela's grandmother, wrapped in a raincoat, her silver hair gathered in a messy bun. She seemed like a figure from a fairy tale, the fairy godmother appearing at the darkest moment. "My goodness, child," Beatrice said, her voice a rough whisper but filled with alarming calm. She didn't seem surprised, but resigned, as if she'd been expecting this scene for a long time. So this is what passion does to the young, puts them in the mud during a storm. Isabela began to cry, a mixture of relief, pain, and shame. "Grandma, please don't take us back." Beatrice looked at them both, her granddaughter, pale and trembling, and the river's boy, holding his shoulder with a pained expression, but his eyes fixed on Isabela with a devotion impossible to ignore. She sighed deeply, and for a moment, she seemed all her 75 years. "Your father's car is 5 minutes behind mine," she said, the simplicity of the statement laden with danger. "He's furious. He found your farewell letter." She paused, letting the gravity of the situation hang in the soaked air. "Get in, quickly." With surprising strength for her age, she helped the two injured young people settle into the back seat of the car. The motorcycle was left behind, a defeated monument to a poorly conceived plan. Beatrice didn't take them back to the Mendoza mansion. Instead, she drove to her own house, a cozy cottage by the river, in the most neutral part of the property, away from the main house's eyes. While tending to their wounds, a sprained ankle for Isabela, a dislocated shoulder for Lucas, she watched them. She saw how Lucas squeezed Isabela's hand as she received stitches, how Isabela whispered words of encouragement to him. She saw the love, real and tangible, not the juvenile rebellion Hector described. "Your father thinks the world is made of fences, Isabela," Beatrice said, preparing herbal tea in her cozy kitchen. "He builds more every day, fearing what's on the other side. But I'm too old to believe in fences. They only serve to keep us from seeing the neighbor's garden." She looked at Lucas, who was pale but conscious, his arm immobilized in an improvised sling. "Your painting, the one he made of you, it's beautiful, captures your light." Isabela and Lucas exchanged glances, surprised. How did she know? "A grandmother knows many things," she said, as if reading their thoughts. "And a grandmother who was once young and foolish knows even more." Meanwhile, at the main mansion, Hector was furious, Ray called the police and accused the Rivers of kidnapping. That's when the phone rang. It was Beatrice. "They're with me, Hector," she said, her voice firm. "They're safe and injured. Come here, alone, and come with a father's heart, not a general's." The order was a shock. Hector respected his mother, even feared her sharp tongue. He went, against his own will, alone. Entering the cottage, he saw the scene. His daughter, pale with her ankle bandaged, sitting on the sofa next to the Rivers boy, who held his immobilized shoulder. There was an intimacy in the scene, a stillness that disarmed his anger. He didn't see a criminal. He saw an injured young man looking at his daughter, as if she were the only son on a cloudy day. Beatrice allowed no arguments. They tried to run away. "Hector, your daughter preferred to risk her life on the road in a storm rather than marry the man you chose. What does that tell you?" Hector didn't answer. He just looked at Isabela, and for the first time in years, he saw not his heiress, but his daughter, frightened, determined, and deeply in love. It was the first crack in the granite wall of his pride. He didn't give his blessing. He couldn't so easily, but he didn't drag them out of there. He just turned and left in silence. As the door closed behind him, Isabela sat up straighter, a new determination shining in her green eyes. The escape had failed, but the war for the right to love had only just begun, and for the first time, she felt that perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't fighting alone. The week following the failed escape plan transformed Mrs. Beatrice's cottage into an improvised sanctuary, a neutral zone amid the silent war between two families. For Isabela and Lucas, those days represented a paradox. They were physically closer than ever, sharing the grandmother's cozy space, yet emotionally besieged by the consequences of their choices. Hector Mendoza made good on his silent threat. The day after the incident, two foremen arrived at the cottage to collect Isabela, but Beatrice, with an authority no one in Serenity Springs dared challenge, blocked their entrance. "Tell my son his daughter will stay with me until she recovers," she announced, standing in the doorway like an ancestral sentinel. "And if he wants to discuss the matter, he can come personally, without sending his soldiers." The men retreated, embarrassed, and Hector didn't appear. Instead, the bureaucratic siege began. Isabela's credit card was canceled. Her access to personal bank accounts, supervised by her father, was blocked. Even her cell phone was deactivated. It was a clear attempt to force her into submission through financial control. Lucas faced his own isolation. From the cottage, he called his apartment in Fountain Valley, only to discover the line had been cut. A friend who tried to visit him was intercepted by Rafael Rivers outside the Mendoza property and informed, in no delicate terms, that Lucas wasn't receiving visitors. "Seems they put us in quarantine," Lucas observed on the second morning, watching to the window the unusual activity on the road leading to the cottage. Clearly, Hector's men mounting surveillance. "My father always believed everything, including people, has a price," Isabela responded, her fingers tracing the edges of Lucas's sling. "He thinks if he cuts us off from the world, we'll eventually surrender." What Hector hadn't counted on was the underground network of allies beginning to form. The maid who had helped Isabela, Maria, became their secret link to the outside world. Through her, messages were sent and received, always with Beatrice's tacit knowledge, who pretended not to notice the folded notes appearing under the back doormat. It was through Maria that Lucas learned his downtown studio had been closed by his father. The canvases, the brushes, years of work, all confiscated under the allegation of protecting his future. The news hit Lucas with physical force, but when Isabela approached concerned, he straightened his shoulders. "They can take my canvases, but they can't take what I see," he said, his determination renewing in adversity. "Nor can they take what I feel for you." That afternoon, with Beatrice's tacit permission, he began drawing again. Using charcoal and paper the grandmother kept in a forgotten drawer, he began capturing scenes from life in the cottage. Isabela reading near the fireplace, Beatrice tending her plants, the morning light entering through the kitchen window. They were simple sketches, but full of life, a silent testimony that his art couldn't be contained. Meanwhile, in Serenity Springs, news of the romantic kidnapping, as the story was dubbed by the local press, spread like wildfire. The Serenity Springs Gazette traditionally sympathetic to the Rivers, published a discreet article about youth from traditional families whose romance defies social conventions. The Valley Chronicle, more conservative and with ties to the Mendozas, referred to the incident as a regrettable case of juvenile rebellion encouraged by disruptive elements. The division in the town reflected that of the families. In cafes and squares, people took sides. The elders generally condemned the romance as an affront to tradition. The younger ones saw it as a romantic tale, a symbol of freedom against archaic rules. Within the Mendoza family itself, cracks began to appear. Clara, the cousin who had previously warned Isabela, appeared at the cottage on Thursday, claiming to bring town groceries for Beatrice. "Half the family thinks you shamed the Mendoza name," she whispered to Isabela while helping unload groceries from the car. "The other half, mainly the women, thinks you had courage where they only had fear." "And you, Clara?" Isabela asked, surprised by the visit. Clara looked at Lucas, sketching on the porch, then back at her cousin. "I think love should be a bridge, not a fence. But be careful, Isabela. Bridges can be burned from both sides." On the Rivers side, the division was equally profound. While attorney Robert maintained his inflexible position, his wife, Mrs. Helena, began showing signs of doubt. She called the cottage on Friday, asking to speak with Beatrice. "I heard my son was injured," she said, her voice restrained but laden with emotion. "Is he receiving proper care?" Beatrice, holding the receiver with a firm hand, responded with unusual gentleness. "Your future daughter-in-law is a competent nurse, Helena, and your son is more resilient than he seems." There was silence on the other end of the line. Tell him his sister asked about him. It was little, but it was a start. The message, when relayed to Lucas, made his eyes shine with hope. His younger sister, Sophia, had always been his accomplice in the family. If she was trying to make contact, it meant not all the Rivers had closed doors. On Saturday, the first direct confrontation between the families occurred. Hector Mendoza, tired of waiting for his daughter's surrender, appeared at the cottage accompanied by Sergio Montenegro. From across the river, almost as if coordinated, attorney Robert Rivers arrived with Raphael. Beatrice, anticipating the confrontation, had prepared the ground. She received the four men on the porch, refusing to let them enter the house. "This circus needs to end," Hector announced, ignoring Lucas, who watched from the living room window. "Isabela, you come home now and make public apologies to Sergio and his family. We can still salvage some dignity from this situation." Attorney Robert intervened, his tone cutting. "My son will return with us and end this embarrassment. There are positions waiting for him at the practice, provided he demonstrates remorse." It was then that Isabela and Lucas came out of the house, hand in hand. They were pale but determined. "I'm not sorry, Dad," Isabela said, her voice clear and firm, carrying across the river. "And I'm not coming home to marry Sergio." "I'm not sorry either," Lucas echoed, looking directly at his father. "And I won't return to be a lawyer I don't want to be." Sergio, who had remained silent, stepped forward. "You're choosing dishonor, Isabela. Choosing a man with no future over a life of privilege and respect." "Respect earned at what price, Sergio?" she retorted, her green eyes sparkling. "The price of my unhappiness? The price of denying who I love." The confrontation seemed about to escalate when Beatrice intervened with the authority of someone who had witnessed decades of family conflicts. "Enough," she said, her voice low but carrying unquestionable authority. "You four powerful men tremble before the love of two young people. That says more about you than them." She looked at Hector. "Your fear of losing control is blinding you to the daughter you have." She turned to attorney Robert. "Your pride is preventing you from seeing the son you raised." Her gaze included Sergio and Raphael. "And you too are so concerned with inheriting empires you've forgotten empires are made of people, not lands or offices." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any shouting match. Hector seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 seconds. Attorney Robert adjusted his glasses, a nervous gesture betraying his disturbance. 1 week. Beatrice said finally, "Give them 1 week here, without interference. After that, If you still want to destroy their happiness, at least you'll have the decency to look them in the eyes while you do it. Surprisingly, it was the younger ones, Sergio and Raphael, who retreated first. Sergio turned and went to his car without another word. Raphael followed suit after one last meaningful look at Lucas. Hector and attorney Robert remained a moment longer, looking at each other across the river separating their properties, as if truly seeing each other for the first time. 1 week, Hector agreed, the cost of concession visible on his face. Attorney Robert merely nodded, before turning and following his son. That evening, in the cottage, the atmosphere was different. Something had shifted in the balance of power. They were still isolated, still under surveillance, but for the first time, they had directly faced opposition and not retreated. Lucas, inspired by the events, began working on a new painting. Using paints Beatrice had secretly sent forward through Maria, he began capturing the porch scene. The 4 men standing as representatives of an old world, and he and Isabela hand in hand, representing a new one. As he worked, Isabela read aloud to him, no longer escape novels, but stories of resistance, of people who defied conventions and changed the world. With each page, they felt less like fugitives and more like pioneers. In town, news of the porch confrontation spread, distorted, and amplified by the game of telephone that was local gossip. In some versions, Beatrice had faced the 2 patriarchs with a symbolic sword. In others, Isabela and Lucas had announced they would marry right there. In the cottage, the reality was less dramatic, but more significant. That night, sitting at Beatrice's kitchen table, the 3 were planning no longer an escape, but a future. "We need to show them our love isn't a passing fantasy," Isabela said, her fingers interlaced with Lucas's. "We need to show we can build something together." Lucas looked at the unfinished painting, then at Isabela. "I'm going to finish this series. I'm going to exhibit it publicly, not hidden in a gallery, but where everyone can see. And I'm going to start my botanical reserve project," Isabela decided, not as the Mendoza heiress, but as Isabela, simply. Beatrice watched them, a quiet smile touching her lips. "Finally," she murmured, "finally you stop reacting and start acting." The week of truce had begun, and with it, the first serious cracks in the foundations of the prejudice that had divided Serenity Springs for generations. The romance defying prejudices was about to become the seed of a much greater transformation. The week of truce granted by Hector Mendoza and attorney Robert Rivers transformed into a laboratory of possibilities. Inside Beatrice's cottage, away from the judgmental eyes of Serenity Springs, Isabela and Lucas not only recovered from their physical injuries, but began building the foundations of the future they wanted to share. While Lucas worked on his new painting series, which he called the 7 Days of Truce, Isabela immersed herself in her botanical reserve plans. Using botany books from Beatrice's library and topographic maps Maria had secretly managed to bring, she began designing what she called the Concord Garden, a space that would unite native species from both riverbanks in a single harmonious ecosystem. "Look," she explained to Lucas on a rainy afternoon, sketches spread across the living room table. "Here, flowers from Windy Hill will grow side by side with plants from Fountain Valley. It will be a living metaphor for what Serenity Springs could be." Lucas studied the detailed drawings, impressed not only by the vision but by the depth of botanical knowledge Isabela had almost secretly acquired over the years. "You should show this to your father," he suggested. "It's a commercially viable project, not just an ornamental garden." "One day," she promised, her green eyes shining with renewed determination. "But first I need to prove I could do it alone." Meanwhile, in town, tensions began giving way to more complex curiosities. The story of the forbidden romance had become the dominant topic in Serenity Springs, and previously silenced opinions began finding voice. Mrs. Marta, the owner of the cafe where Isabela and Lucas secretly met, became an unexpected defender of the couple. When customers commented on the scandal, she responded with stories of how the two would talk for hours about art and nature, always with mutual respect and admiration. "I've seen many couples in this town," she'd say while serving fresh coffee, "but few with such genuine love in their eyes." Among the older employees of both families, similar sentiments began emerging. George, the foreman who once watched Isabela, confessed to a colleague that he admired the girl's courage, a significant slip, as he always referred to her as Miss Isabela with impersonal formality. On the riverside, the family housekeeper, who had raised Lucas since he was a boy, began openly questioning Attorney Robert's decision to lock his son's studio. "The boy has a gift," she insisted to anyone who would listen in the mansion's kitchen. "They should be proud, not punishing him." On the 5th day of the truce, a development occurred that nobody expected. Sophia Rivers, Lucas's younger sister, appeared at Beatrice's cottage carrying a thick folder. "Dad thinks I'm visiting our aunt on the east side of town," she announced, hugging her brother tightly. "Actually, I came to bring you this." It was a complete paperwork for business registration and trademark for a studio gallery. Sophia, who worked in the legal department of the family company, had used her knowledge to prepare everything Lucas would need to open his own space. "You don't need the family name to succeed," she said, her eyes, as dark as her brother's, shining with contained tears. "You just need your talent." While brother and sister reconciled, Beatrice took Isabela into the garden. "Time for you to make your own move," the grandmother whispered. "The mayor is organizing a commission for sustainable urban development. He's a grandson of a Mendoza on his mother's side, your distant cousin. I'll arrange a meeting." The meeting happened the next day in the mayor's office in downtown Serenity Springs. For the first time since the conflict began, Isabela left the cottage alone, wearing a simple pantsuit that had belonged to her mother. The town she drove through seemed different, more complex, less divided into opposing camps. Mayor Edward received her with cautious curiosity. "Isabela Mendoza," he said, offering her a chair. "Your situation, well, it's the talk of the town." "That's precisely why I'm here, cousin," she replied, deliberately using the kinship term. "Because my situation perfectly illustrates what Serenity Springs needs to overcome." Over the next 40 minutes, she presented her Concord Garden project not as a romantic dream, but as a concrete urban development proposal, a space that would attract tourism, educate children about local flora, and more importantly, symbolize a new identity for the town. "Interesting," Edward commented at the end, his fingers drumming on the proposal. "Very interesting. But you understand that, given the circumstances—" "Precisely because of the circumstances," Isabela interrupted gently. "Imagine the message Serenity Springs would send by supporting a project that symbolically unites what was divided." The mayor didn't commit, but promised to consider the proposal. It was more than Isabela had hoped for. Meanwhile, Lucas was putting the finishing touches on his painting series. The 7 canvases captured different moments from the week of truce, from dawn light over the river to the nightly intimacy of the cottage, always with Isabela and him as integral parts of the landscape, not intruders. "It's ready," he announced on the morning of the 7th day, when the truce would officially end. "Tomorrow, I'm exhibiting these canvases publicly." The news spread quickly. On the afternoon of the 7th day, both Hector Mendoza and attorney Robert Rivers appeared at the cottage, each bringing their own version of an ultimatum. This time, Beatrice let them in. The 4 sat in the living room, Hector and attorney Robert in opposite armchairs, Isabela and Lucas side by side on the sofa, hands intertwined. "The truce is over," Hector began, his voice more restrained than last time. "Isabela, you come home now and accept a position in property management. Forget this reckless romance and focus on your duty." Attorney Robert followed suit. "Lucas, you return with us and take the position I prepared for you. We can forget these deviations and move forward." It was then that Isabela and Lucas revealed their cards. "Dad," Isabela said, her voice calm but firm, rather than return to mansion, "I'd like to present you with a business proposal." She unrolled the Concord Garden plans on the coffee table, explaining not just the project's poetic vision, but its practical aspects, costs, projected financial return, job creation potential. Hector listened silently, his eyes scanning the detailed drawings. For the first time, he saw not the rebellious daughter, but a woman with vision and executive capability. Meanwhile, Lucas addressed his father. "I won't refuse the position you're offering, Dad, but I'd like to modify it." He explained his idea of creating an arts and culture department within Rivers Enterprises, not as a decorative appendage, but as a strategic division that could partner with Isabella's project, developing visual identity, educational programs, and even a product line inspired by local flora. Attorney Robert looked stunned. "You thought about the commercial aspects?" "I've always thought, Dad," Lucas replied. "I just believe beauty and business aren't incompatible." The stalemate that followed was broken by an unexpected intervention. Through the window, they saw a small crowd approaching. Young people from Serenity Springs, children of employees from both families, students, local artists. They carried signs with phrases like "Love has no sides" and "United Serenity Springs." Maria, the maid, appeared at the door, smiling. "Seems the town decided for you." Hector and Attorney Robert exchanged a prolonged look, not of enmity, but of mutual recognition. Outside, their children were united. The town they both loved, each in their own way, was calling for change. It was Hector who broke the silence. "The Concord Garden will need a competent landscape architect." Attorney Robert took a deep breath. "And the arts department will need a visionary director." They weren't explicit blessings, but they were bridges, fragile, improvised, but real. In the month that followed, Serenity Springs transformed. The Concord Garden became reality on land donated by the municipality, a neutral area that had once symbolically separated Windy Hill from Fountain Valley. At the inauguration, Isabela and Lucas cut the ribbon together, under the eyes of a town celebrating not just a new green space, but a new possibility. Their wedding, when it finally happened, was the event that united Serenity Springs definitively, held in the Concord Garden itself. It featured Hector Mendoza walking his daughter down the central aisle and Attorney Robert Rivers as Lucas's best man. When the priest asked, "Who give this woman?" Hector responded, "Her family and her town," before placing Isabella's hand in Lucas's. The romance that defied prejudices had not only survived, it had transformed into the catalyst for a much greater reconciliation. In the following years, the two families discovered their strengths complemented each other. The Mendozas brought their practical knowledge of the land to the Rivers' cultural projects. The Rivers offered their expertise in planning and law to expand the Mendozas' businesses. When Isabela and Lucas's first grandchild was born, a girl with her mother's green eyes and her father's artistic determination, Hector and Attorney Robert found themselves discussing not old disputes, but which school would be best for the child. "Perhaps we could create our own school," Attorney Robert suggested at a family meeting. And the idea, which would have seemed absurd before, was met with genuine interest. Beatrice's cottage, where everything had changed, became a pilgrimage site for young lovers in Serenity Springs, a symbol that love could, indeed, overcome the strongest barriers. Years later, at the inauguration of the Beatrice Bridge, an elegant structure replacing the old stone bridge where Isabela and Lucas were nearly captured. Their granddaughter, now 7 years old, asked why everyone in town seemed to know each other. "Because one day, sweetheart, your grandfather and I decided love was more important than hate," Isabela replied, holding Lucas's hand. "And did it work?" the girl asked, innocent. Lucas smiled, his eyes scanning the crowd united on the bridge, Mendozas and Rivers, once enemies, now sharing not just grandchildren, but a future. "Yes, it worked, but it took a whole town to understand." The romance that defied prejudices had changed two families forever, but its greatest legacy was perhaps showing Serenity Springs that the bridges connecting us are always stronger than the fences dividing us, and that love, when brave enough to bloom in darkness, can eventually illuminate even the darkest corners of the human heart. If this story was moving for you, leave a comment and we'll see you in the next video.